"And you're sure you haven't forgotten anything?" Nia asked, as she tried to somehow look back at James without moving her head too much, in which she fell gloriously and thus inadvertently pulled her own hair, since James's iron grip was holding onto it quite tightly. "Can we not go through all this again? I already had to convince the Admiral that I am more than able to pack my own bag as a grown-ass man," James complained, and didn't even bother to tell her to stop squirming, since she should have known not to do that herself. He had to concentrate on not losing his place in the process of weaving the black strands into small, tightly woven braids, a process that had become far from second nature to him since it had been so long since he had last done it. "It's not my first trip into space." Nia was quickly forced to give up on her endeavours to look at him while they were talking, and instead resorted to making her reactions known with loud, audible signals, like the very deliberate scoff she let out at that moment. "And after how well that first time went, I'm somehow supposed to be less worried somehow?" she countered, with a doubtful voice, but at least she held still now, so he wouldn't have to be worried about accidentally hurting her anymore. James snorted, and rolled his eyes behind her back, while he got to fully test the dexterity of his new fingers as he put one thin strand of hair over the other carefully. "Well, it didn't go bad because I didn't pack enough underwear exactly," he unsubtly reminded her, and finally finished the braid by securing it, immediately moving on to the next bit of hair, separating some new strands from the larger mass. It had come as no surprise for him when his sister had asked him to braid her hair, despite the results usually being quite underwhelming when compared to the ones she could get when she did it herself these days. In the hyper-busy environment of being so close to a departure, it was her way of getting him to slow down enough for a private conversation. Nia took a deep breath, filled her lounges with air that she let out in a slow and long-lasting sigh, which caused James to jokingly add, "And I did remember to pack a lot more firepower this time." Nia's sigh was cut short by a single chuckle that snuck itself in there. "Surprisingly, that is not a huge consolation," she commented, and leaned her head back slightly to make things a bit easier on him while closing her eyes. "I'm not exactly comfortable with the thought of seeing you shoot up the place either." James feigned surprise, and although she couldn't see it, he raised his eyebrows high as he looked down at her. "Not?" he asked exaggeratedly, and tilted his head from side to side. "I thought that was one of the pulls of having a brother in the military, to get to see him be all badass and shoot stuff." "Oh, get real," Nia replied, in a mixture of laughter and annoyance, and blindly threw the back of her hand backwards in an attempt to slap against his shoulder. For what it was well aimed, and the weak hit actually made contact, although she had not quite kept in mind that his right shoulder was fully robotic now, which meant that the attack had even less of an impact than it would normally have had. "I know you can shoot your way out of things, but I'd hate to see you get in trouble again to begin with. And since when are you so proud of being in the military?" She relaxed slightly, rotating her shoulders and stretching her neck as far as the situation would allow. "Besides, that's not really the version of you I want to see presented to the entire galaxy anyway," she added in a mumble, of which James wasn't entirely sure if he was supposed to understand it or not. But, since he did, he decided to comment on it, raising his tone to a slightly teasing one as he asked, "Oh yeah? And which version of me would you like to see out there instead?" Nia laughed and ruminatively raised a finger to her lips, as if she needed to ponder that for a moment. "How about," she started off, and then stopped as she thought for a few seconds longer, before coming to her final conclusion. "The one that brought a pair of 7-inch heels and nearly broke his ankle trying to walk in them, because I was afraid to practice on my own." James looked down at her dark head in slight disbelief. "That's the James you want to represent humanity?" he asked, emphasizing the first word to slightly ridicule her choice in his tone alone. "The one who couldn't walk straight and broke 2 pairs of shoes by virtue of being an idiot?" Nia didn't seem to take his doubting too hard. "No, the one who was willing to not be able to walk straight and break 2 pairs of shoes simply because he could," she retorted, not really elaborating on her point since it wasn't really necessary. "Got it. So you want me to look like an idiot," James jested, purposely misunderstanding her point as much as he could. But his sister didn't take the bait. "You got there eventually," she said almost encouragingly instead, and raised her right hands to give him an OK sign above her head. "You're better in heels than most of my friends are these days." A skill he rarely, if ever, got to use, mostly because wearing heels was the exact opposite of fun usually, even if he was good at it. Without a good reason, he very rarely decided to wear them voluntarily. Since he had no witty counter for her statement, James decided to get serious again. "I don't know how much of that is applicable here," he said, while finishing up the next braid of hair. "I might be willing to stumble around with 2 left feet, but that doesn't mean humanity is. I can only to such lengths before somebody feels that I'm not doing it properly. Nia nodded as far as her hair would allow her to, and the bright lights in the room reflected dimly on her dark skin as she moved. I'm just saying, she explained, with a more serious intonation as well. If the people you're trying to reach are the ones who aren't happy with the way things have been going, with the way the community and the council have been running things, maybe it's good to show them how it could be done. After all, you're out there to represent yourself first, and humanity second. She put an emphasis on that last part, as if she was seriously reminding him of that fact. James let out a shallow breath. It's a bit more complicated than that, he said tonelessly, and his eyes inadvertently wandered down onto his arm. As he worked, his sleeve was rolled up far enough that the fading scars of 5 deep scratches on his left arm were visible. He hadn't even known that he wasn't playing by the community's rules when he got them, but it had gotten people's attention back then, even so. I hope I'm not asking too much of you. He then changed the topic when his mind began to walk down memory lane with the chain of events that had followed that fateful moment. For a moment it seemed like Nia wasn't following his sudden change of tone, and she needed a few seconds before she had mentally caught up to what he was referring to. Well, with my plans on working on a communal ship on ice for the moment, it's not like I have anything else going on, she then replied, once it had finally clicked for her what he was talking about. I kind of planned the next years of my life around that. James pressed his lips together, and it felt like the droning of the running ship was suddenly getting louder, even though that was most likely just his imagination. Still, just because you don't have to do anything else, that doesn't mean, he started. I wanted to seriously emphasize that the one circumstance had nothing to do with the other in this case. However, he was quickly interrupted. I'm fully capable of saying no, James, even to you. You do well to remember that, she said, and turned her head to the side, even to the point of yanking on her own hair, just so she could mildly glare at him. After a moment of holding that dark gaze, she relaxed with a brief exhale, and returned her gaze forward before adding in a more soft and caring tone. Your friends are in good hands, whether I'm there or not, but with everything that happened, I totally get that you want to have a familiar face around them, and it's really no bother at all. An extended vacation on Mars might be just the right thing for me, now that my future plans have been so thoroughly dashed. She paused there at first, but since James had to think for a moment how he should even reply to that, it gave her enough time to add on to that further. And unlike you, I don't even have an alternative right now, she stated, in an almost nonchalant way, with a slight shrug of her shoulders. Or maybe I should enlist as well. It looks like the military is probably going to take what it can get right now. Even though that was obviously a joke, James's breath caught in his throat for a moment. Please don't do this to me, he said, and tried to give his voice a humorous spin that would be more fitting to the clear jest she was going for. I don't think my poor heart could handle it. Fine, Nia replied, as drawn out as she could, and made a rotating motion with her head to support the tone of her voice. I guess I'll just apply it to some more research projects instead. Wouldn't want you to have to worry about me after all. There was a certain derision in her tone as well, clearly hinting at something, most likely the fact that she now constantly had to worry about him. James felt like he didn't have to mention that he would change that fact for an instant if he could. By now, after having gotten into his groove, he was almost finished with her hair, weaving the last few strands together into a final braid. I'll be safe, he assured her, as his fingers finished the last bit of weaving. At the first sign of trouble, we're out of there. I'm neither interested in taking another diplomatic incident, nor in either losing or taking another appendage. I just want to talk to some cat people and assure them I'm on their side. Nothing to worry about. He probably sounded about as unconvinced of that himself as he possibly could, although it was very much the truth. All done, he added, with a stroke across Nia's now more or less finely braided hair. Nia picked up a hand mirror from a dresser next to her, and briefly checked out his work with some quick glances at herself. You used to be better at that, she teasingly commented after a moment of evaluation, and put the mirror down again, right before she turned on the chair to face him. James didn't even get to reply anything before she suddenly fell into him with a surprise hug. His arms closed around her back after a moment of shock, and they held each other for a few seconds. Save it for the goodbyes, he joked, patting her on the back carefully. It's wasted if it's not at the hangar, minutes away from the shuttle starting. Nia pulled away and looked at him with slightly disappointed pursed lips. You're mixing something up there, she said. That's what lovers are supposed to do. Too bad yours is on the shuttle with you. Kinda loses the impact if you just get in together afterwards. James laughed breathlessly. It would, wouldn't it? He agreed, imagining the scene before his inner eye. All the tear-jerking and heartfelt words, just to walk hand in hand and leave together. Just call me, alright? Nia pulled him out of his thoughts again, returning to the topic at hand. No excuse this time. Dunamo is located firmly within the galactic plane. How does she even know about that conversation? James chuckled awkwardly and rubbed the back of his head, knowing that he wasn't exactly the best at staying in touch, even when he had the possibility to easily do so. I'll do my best, he replied. But just in case, give me a call every now and then as well. And? What do you think? Shida could hear her own, artificially enhanced voice ask, even though the tone was slightly muffled due to her ears being mostly covered. As she spoke, she knew a very vague approximation of her face was being projected to the outside, so she made sure to make many exaggerated expressions to truly show off what this new helmet thingy could do. It's cute, Curie replied in their usual synthetic voice, and she'd immediately wondered if she had ever heard the cyborg describe something with the word cute before. Not very technical when compared to their usual taste in words. An interesting compromise between the obscure faces and the want or need for expressions. With a slight groan, Shida leaned back on Curie's workbench and pulled the new breath filter off her face again to grant her senses some much-needed freedom. Although admittedly, the sounds of the humans working on all kinds of synthetic replacements for nature weren't some that she hadn't minded being dampened by the mask too much. The constant drilling and hammering and bending weren't exactly soothing to her sensitive ears. That's the idea, she replied, putting the filter down next to her leg while leaning forwards, putting her elbows onto her thighs. Although, unless Dunamo has changed a lot, most people are probably going to find them hilarious instead. Shida didn't know why she had sought the cyborg's company at a time like this. She had spent most of her recent free time preparing for what was to come, and more often than not she forgot to eat, drink or sleep in the process if James wasn't around to remind her. However, today something had pulled her down to the med-eng area, towards this square of workspace that Curie occupied most of the time these days. Curie almost seemed to wonder about her statement, as they stared off into space for a moment in their usual unnervingly unmoving way. Are you excited about returning to your homeworld? They then suddenly asked, their vision seemingly refocusing onto Shida as they turned their bodies slightly to the side. Shida chewed on her lower lip with one of her fangs and gently scratched across the fabric of her pants with extended claws, making a rhythmic grating sound as she thought about how to reply to that. Not particularly, she finally admitted, without going into any detail. Curie bobbed their body up and down in their approximation of a nod. I can relate to that, they replied matter-of-factly, and scuttled over to the free space on their workbench, right next to where Shida was occupying it. Although our situations are vastly different, of course, I would also rather not return to my home planet, even in our current situation. Shida nodded distractedly. It would be hard to find a better place for you than with the humans right now, she agreed with Curie, thinking of the rather nonchalant way the primates had behaved around the cyborg, when compared to nearly any other species she knew of. Even if my people welcome me with open arms, I think I would still prefer the humans to them, Curie clarified, with a slight shift of their eye in Shida's direction. While I would like to think that I am not resentful or vindictive, I would be lying if I said that I didn't have some lingering feelings towards those of my kind, more so than I have for other species. Shida lifted one hand to wave their explanation off. No need to justify anything to me, she said. I totally get it. And is it the same for you as well? The cyborg followed up on that, and Shida wasn't sure if they were interested in what she was thinking in and of itself, or if they wanted some sort of possible solidarity out of her. However, as they had said, their situations were vastly different. Well, it's not like I was cast out by my people or anything like that. I could have stayed, I could have left, nobody would have really cared. It was entirely my own decision to pack my things and leave. And if I were to come back now, that wouldn't turn any heads either, she explained. All in all, I don't really care much for my people. Sure, they understand me a bit better than most, but that's about where any advantages they may have end. Of course, she would possibly think differently if her experiences had been any different. Maybe if she had grown up on some cushy farm instead of a brat house in the middle of the city, she would think that her people were the greatest of all. Or maybe not. She leaned back as memories flashed through her mind, and they weren't exactly pleasant ones. Dunamo is not a nice place, she continued her explanation, and her claws slightly dug through the fabric of her pants. One of the death worlds that deserve their reputation, although that has little to do with the planet itself. Trust me, you wouldn't like it there. Curie was silent for a while, as they used a very fine screwdriver to fasten some tiny screws to something between a jumble of cables in whatever they were working on there, now that James's arm was done. I hope Mars is a nice place, they finally stated, apparently not quite finding a way to continue the conversation in the same direction it was going. Shadae's ears twitched slightly at the change of topic, but she still managed to sound encouraging as she said, "With the way that the humans been talking about it, I'm sure it is." Curie paused again for a bit. "Will you come there as well, when you have finished your business on Dunima?" they asked. Shada perked up in slight surprise. "Who knows, really?" she replied and shrugged her shoulders. "Depends on where we're being sent next. But at some point, sure, we'll probably come there. Although I think James is a lot more eager to show me Earth than he is to show me Mars. He's lucky I can handle the gravity." For a moment, it almost seemed like Curie was taking a deep breath, even though there wasn't exactly something that they did. "You'll be gone for a while," they finally stated, and Shada couldn't exactly interpret the emotion that was supposed to be associated with that very simple statement. However, she wasn't going to lie to Curie. "Most likely, yes," she said, matter-of-factly. Curie didn't really reply to that. They mostly seemed thoughtful. They even interrupted their work to ponder. Shada looked at them silently for a while. Then, after a few heartbeats had passed, she said, "I'm going to miss you too, Curie." Just a while ago, she never would have imagined that she would someday say that. The cyborgs slightly lifted themselves up in surprise, and they stared at Shada, as if they needed to process what she had just said. But then they quickly returned to their work, and it almost seemed like they were turning the screws with some new purpose this time.
I must say, I'm not used to just my most personal belongings taking up quite so much storage,"
Moore admitted, sometime later, while looking down at the multiple large bags and suitcases that had been filled with everything she would take with her once she embarked on the human warship that she probably should have left quite a while ago.
"Usually one bag is more than enough unless I take devices or furniture with me."
"Well, now you know why we always have so much luggage," Shada commented, looking back up at the old lady while she picked up one of the unwieldy pieces of luggage for her, knowing fully well that most of them were filled with all kinds of blankets, simple clothes, trinkets, and other mundanities the old lady had amassed from gifts given to her by the humans ever since they had arrived in their midst. As someone who had never before cared for such things, she obviously wasn't used to carrying so much around with her. However, she seemed very much hesitant to even entertain the thought of getting rid of some of it again, now that she had it, even if that meant carrying a lot more stuff around. Moore looked down at the feline and apparently saw her opportunity, slowly saying,
"Speaking of which, have you—"
However, she was cut off by a loud and almost disbelieving human laugh. "Please spare me," James said decisively, as he also carried around some of Moore's baggage. "I know you mean well, but if one more person asks me if we packed everything, I'm going to implode." He forcefully sat the bag he was carrying down and put his hands on his hips. "We've got clothes, hygiene articles, all counted 3 times, electronics, equipment, weapons, and I packed enough sunscreen to supply a vampire for a trip through the desert," he ranted. And his intentions were clear, even though he was the only one who truly understood what a vampire even was. His tone managed to remain bright enough that his tirade couldn't be taken as an insult, although it was still clear that he really was pretty sick of hearing it at this point. Moore did take it with humour.
"Well, if you are this sure, I have no choice but to believe you,"
she said conciliatorily, and made some reassuring gestures with her large hands. James's gaze caught Shada's for a moment, and they gave each other an amused smile.
"I would tell you to stay safe as well, but that probably will not be necessary either,"
Moore then added, raising her long arms into a shrug.
"However, I cannot quite help myself, so instead, I'm going to tell you to look after yourself. Even if you will have a lot to do and it will be a stressful environment, take the time to make sure you're all right. Eat and drink enough, get the sleep you need. It is important, and also something I know that both of you will struggle with."
The old Raphaelite made it a point to look at James and Shada, one after the other, with one of her wet, dark eyes intensely, and with her large frame and the 4 huge horns on her head, she would have almost looked intimidating if they hadn't known her. It was almost like she wanted to force them to comply with her gaze alone. However, James was still quite quick to reply. "No promises." Shada saw this as an opportunity to have some backup and said, "Oh, I'll make sure that you get sleep." James interrupted his eye contact with Moore to instead look over at Shada with an eyebrow raised. "Don't you mean you'll make sure I get no sleep?" he asked a bit teasingly, and before Shada could even answer, Moore was already speaking up again.
"Oh, please," she said with her claws raised. "No details. I am no prude, but I need no insights into your intimacies. I think that is better for all. Just, Whenever you take a moment to rest, make sure to hold each other accountable, so that you stay fresh and healthy.
James seemed more than happy with his comment being played off like that, and decided to not further press the issue, which was just as well for Shada. She already knew that James would remind her to eat or drink usually, since he needed to do so much more often than she did. And on the other hand, she couldn't stay on her feet nearly as long as he could, so she had been kinda serious when she said she would make sure he would sleep. In that regard, things worked out pretty well, all things considered.
Look after each other, you two,
more seemingly repeated her previous statement, although it had a bit of a different intonation this time. James and Shada both individually nodded. And you be careful as well, James replied after a moment, finally finding his voice again. He turned around and now laboriously sat down on the bag he'd been carrying around previously. Not that Mars isn't safe, but still, you never know. Moore let out a high, throaty chuckle.
No need to worry about me, I have got some years behind me already, but I am touched that you fear for my safety when it is you who will be embarking towards a strange death world, she commented, with her hair flying around slightly from her movement. We're built for it, James replied, folding his hands. While those two talked, Shada stared at Moore for a bit. She wondered if the old woman still thought about the rather unpleasant way the two had split after their last encounter. At least she didn't seem to be openly resentful about it anymore, but she couldn't possibly have forgotten already, could she? After a while, the Raphaelite seemed to notice Shada staring, and she tilted her enormous head a bit more to more easily look back at the feline with an expectant gaze. For a moment, Shada couldn't help but think back to the time when the old woman considered even looking at her constantly during a conversation to be unpleasant staring. And now, Shada was actually staring at her, and she barely seemed to mind. Who would have guessed that you'd ever be so calm about moving in right next to a death world, she said, as Moore was clearly awaiting something out of her. Moore looked up to the ceiling thoughtfully and briefly combed through the fur on her neck with her claws. Yes, my children were quite baffled as well when I told them, she admitted in a ruminative tone. My youngest even thought I may have lost my mind at my old age. I'm honestly not surprised. It is how I raised her, after all. Not exactly my proudest achievement looking back on it.
It must be pretty tough when your mother suddenly becomes so different from the way you've known her to be for so long, Shada suddenly replied, much to her own surprise. Her mouth had just been faster than her mind and spoke what she thought before she could stop it. Of course, gazes immediately turned towards her as everyone likely had a pretty good idea how she would come to such a conclusion. However, now that her filter was turned on again, she wanted to make it clear that she wasn't comparing the situations at all, and so she added, "But she'll be right, I'm sure. If you came around, she'll be there in no time." Moore's nostrils flared as she let out a long breath through her nose.
Yes, I think you are right, she said decisively, although I fear not all will have it that easy.
Shada wasn't sure why she was keeping it vague, even though everyone already knew she was talking about the captain, and how unlikely it was that he was going to have a change of mind as well. If she was completely honest, Shada wasn't even holding out hope that it would be like that. All she wanted was to face him and have her questions answered. But now the mood had taken a considerable nosedive, and since the topic had come up, Shada could already feel her mind drifting in unfavourable directions. Thinking of a way to mitigate this, only one came to mind quickly. She dropped the bag she was holding, and in quick steps she crossed the room until she stood right in front of the enormous form of Moore. Then she just pressed her face into the fur on the old woman's side, and closed her arms around her leg. The long fur tickled her nose and ears, and the warmth of Moore's body was barely noticeable through the thick coat of hair. It smelled of herbs and flowers from the shampoo she used these days. And after a moment of holding her like that, she could feel the Raphaelite's claws softly rub through her own hair, and over the back of her head. The old woman didn't directly say anything, but she made a simultaneously caring and satisfied sound. "Don't get used to it," Shada immediately admonished her, her voice muffled by the masses of fur she had in front of her mouth.
"I would not dream of it,"
Moore replied amusedly, without stopping the gentle stroking through Shada's hair. Shada waited for a bit, focusing on the flowery smell and the feeling in her hair to prevent her mind from wandering, and soon she wasn't thinking of anything anymore. Once that was the case, she slowly pulled herself away from the old woman again. Immediately, Moore also pulled her arm away, allowing Shada to freely step back and look up at her. The sound of breathing close by quickly made her ears twitch to the side, and she followed them, turning her head. While she had been busy focusing on zoning out, James had apparently walked up to them without her noticing, and he was now leaning against the wall only a measure or two away from her and the old lady, looking at them with a sort of restrained enjoyment in his slightly narrowed eyes. However, he didn't say a word about it. Hotels are booked, transportation is pre-rented, permission for the hyperspace stretch is A-OK, looks like everything can go ahead as planned. James summarized the data that had in turn been summarized for him and sent onto his phone. Luggage is packed and stored away, food is planned out, and the military escort is already on board and ready for action, but hopefully won't have to be. Shida walked alongside him through the door of the Sun's docking area, where one of the large human-made shuttles was only waiting for them with its ramp lowered. James had just come out of one more last-minute briefing by his superiors, reminding him for the nth time of what the plan was, which was why they were so much later to the party than everybody else. And of course my guide and interpreter is right at my side, James finished, and put an arm around Shida, pulling her in close for a second before letting go again. Shida chuckled silently, allowing him to squeeze her for a moment. However, as soon as they entered the dock proper, they had to start walking a bit stauncher, since the entire dock was standing at attention. In front of the shuttle, a group of people were already waiting for them. And in front of all, there was of course the Admiral herself. Sternly, the pale woman with dark hair looked at them with her piercing eyes, awaiting their arrival as they marched towards her, coming to a halt about 2 paces away, where they stood at attention. "At ease," Admiral Krieger then said. And not just the two of them, but the entire horde of soldiers and workers around them took that as a sign to relax their posture. "Well played, First Lieutenant Aldwin," the Admiral then complimented James, while she looked at him with what seemed to be pretty genuine regard. Shida didn't quite understand what she meant by that, but she let that statement sit for some time before she continued. "You have your orders, therefore I won't bother you for long, but I am looking forward to your return. Good luck out there." "Thank you, ma'am," James replied, and Shida was pretty sure that it was mostly to uphold protocol, although he did manage to sound rather convincing. The eyes of the Admiral then turned towards Shida. "I expect good work out of you," she let Shida know in no uncertain terms, although she didn't sound unfriendly either. "Do not disappoint me." "Yes, ma'am," Shida replied in her practiced tone. Krieger then looked back and forth between the two for a second, before she purposely stepped aside with a human salute, which the two returned. She then briefly looked over her shoulder. "You've got 5 minutes, she informed them, before stepping completely away from them. "Make it quick." Once she had stepped away, James and Shida were free to step past her and towards the larger group behind her. "Well, this is it," James said, looking past everyone and up to the last shuttle. "I would have loved to stay a bit longer after being gone for so long, but oh well. At least I get to say goodbye this time." "You also get to take your girlfriend along this time," Nia reminded him, being the first to step out of the group, as she spread her arms to give James a big hug. "Goodbye, James. Get back in one piece this time." "I'll do my best," James said, before giving his sister a quick peck in the cheek. "Goodbye, and see you soon." The two let go of each other, and Nia immediately stepped over to also put her arms around Shida, which the feline reciprocated a bit more hesitantly. "Take good care of him, will ya?" the dark-skinned woman asked, while pressing Shida tightly. "I'll bring him back with no parts missing," Shida assured her, and rubbed her back for a moment. Nia then slightly pulled away, but left her hands on Shida's shoulders and looked her in the eyes, as she added, "And you come back all right as well, you hear?" Shida nodded. "Sure," she said, with a slight smile. "Goodbye." "Goodbye," Nia repeated. She seemed confident, although that could have been for show.
"I believe with that she has already said everything," Moore commented, also taking a step forward. "I will be hopefully awaiting your safe return on Mars."
James hugged the side of the large woman tightly. "Goodbye, Moore," he said, with a soft pat on her leg. "Bye," Shida concurred, looking up at the ref light with crossed arms.
"Goodbye, you two,"
Moore said with a deep nod of her head in each of their directions.
"And look out for yourselves."
"You as well," James returned, with nervous laughter and a wave up at her. When Moore stepped aside, James and Shida looked at each other, and then walked tightly together towards the last figure waiting. "I hope you enjoy Mars, Curie," James said to the cyborg, who looked back at them expressionlessly. "You'll have so much to see that before you know it, we're back already," Shida assured them as well. Curie looked at the two for some time longer, and Shida was almost getting worried that they wouldn't get anything out of them before they would have no time left. However, then the cyborg lifted their 2 foremost backwards legs, one towards each of them. "Goodbye, James. Goodbye, Shida," they said calmly. "I'm going to miss you." The Deathworlders looked at each other, before each reaching up and taking one of the metal appendages into their hands. "Goodbye, Curie. I'll miss you too," James said, She'd nodded in agreement, having already expressed as much before. "Goodbye," she said. With that, the cyborg seemed satisfied. "1 minute! Clear the dock!" a voice suddenly yelled out, and everything got into movement. "See you again soon," James yelled after everyone once again, as they too made their way towards the exit of the dock. She'd waved after them. Then she took James's hand. "First Dunama," she said, and made a step towards the shuttle. "Then the captain." James finished her sentence and held her hand tighter as they quickly hurried up the ramp and into the shuttle.